When Dignity Stands Tall, a Charleston Chronicle by Samuel Johnson, prologue. Hello, I'm Samuel Johnson, a Charleston local who's witnessed this city's highs and lows. Today, I'll lead you through every metal detector beep and each heartbeat on the courthouse's marble steps. You won't just see the surface events. You'll feel the emotions, the hidden thoughts, and the secrets behind a judge's confident smile. Get ready. This story will pull you into a whirlwind of justice like nothing you've ever experienced. Part 1. The Table by the Window, May 17, 2023. 1:18 p.m. The afternoon sun bathed the cobblestone streets of downtown Charleston in that peculiar amber glow we get in late spring, the kind that filters through Spanish moss and makes even tourists slow their pace. On East Bay Street, where the salt air mingles with the scent of pralines and aged brick, the Federal House Cafe stood as it had since 1908, quiet and dignified among the more flamboyant tourist destinations. Inside, the clink of silverware against porcelain created a gentle symphony beneath the ceiling fan's rhythmic hum. The lunch crowd was typical for a Wednesday, a mixture of business people with loosened ties, retired couples lingering over sweet tea, and a few solitary diners enjoying the quiet ambiance. Major General Curtis Langston, retired, but unmistakably military in his bearings, stepped through the glass door at precisely 1:20 p.m. The bell overhead jingled softly, and several patrons glanced up briefly before returning to their meals. Curtis didn't demand attention. He never had. But his presence, that silent authority built through decades of command decisions and battlefield judgment, filled the room nonetheless. "Afternoon, Mr. Brefort." "Langston," said Elise Grantham, the 24-year-old hostess who'd been working at the Federal House since she was 16. Her smile was genuine. Curtis was among her favorite regulars. What Elise didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined as she gathered a single menu, was that this routine greeting would be the last normal moment of her day. "Would you like your usual spot by the window?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Curtis nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Yes, thank you, Elise. Just me today." As he followed her across the wooden floor, past tables topped with flickering candles in cut glass holders, a few diners looked up, older folks mostly, some nodding in quiet recognition. Most didn't know exactly who he was, but something in Curtis's measured gait and calm eyes made people notice. It wasn't his height, though at 6'2" he stood taller than most men his age. It wasn't his clothing, though his charcoal gray blazer and pressed slacks spoke of careful attention. It was something deeper, a quality that couldn't be purchased or practiced. Curtis settled into his chair by the tall bay window, folded his napkin precisely across his lap, and exhaled deeply, not with weariness, but with gratitude. At 68, after commanding thousands of troops across 3 combat zones, after losing friends to enemy fire and his beloved wife Eleanor to cancer 7 years prior, Curtis Langston found profound pleasure in these simple moments of peace. Through the window, he watched couples stroll hand in hand along the sidewalk. A golden retriever tugged playfully at its leash. A child pressed her nose against the display window of the chocolate shop across the street. Charleston in spring, a postcard come to life. Chase Bennett, a 22-year-old waiter working his way through the College of Charleston, approached with practiced eagerness. "Good afternoon, sir. The special today is blackened redfish with Carolina gold rice. Our soup is sheh crab." "I'll take the baked salmon," Curtis replied, his voice carrying the soft cadence of low country roots beneath the crisp diction acquired through decades of military briefings. "Collard greens on the side. And sweet tea, please." As Chase stepped away, Curtis glanced at the small bronze plaque near the bar, established 1908. He liked places with history, establishments that had weathered wars and hurricanes and economic downturns yet remained standing. Like people, he thought, the ones worth knowing had weathered something. He sat back, mind drifting to memories of Eleanor laughing on Folly Beach, of cadets he'd mentored at West Point, some who had returned from deployment, others who hadn't. These reflections weren't painful anymore. They were companions, carried close, but not heavy. The peaceful rhythm of the cafe continued around him, the soft jazz from ceiling speakers, the murmur of conversation, the occasional burst of laughter from a corner table. Curtis was halfway through reading the dessert menu, though he never ordered dessert when the front door burst open with enough force to rattle the glass. The cheerful tone of the cafe faltered. Boots thudded across the hardwood floor louder than they needed to be. Conversation slowed. Curtis looked up without turning his head. 3 uniformed officers entered first, scanning the room with practiced eyes. Behind them came a man whose name Curtis didn't yet know, but whose type he recognized instantly from countless encounters across 4 decades of military service. Chief Everett Brody was what locals called Charleston aristocracy third-generation law enforcement, son of a decorated officer, graduate of the Citadel. His father had been police chief in the 1980s. His grandfather had worn the badge in the segregation era. At 52, Brody carried his family legacy like armor burnished and heavy, both shield and burden. His uniform was immaculate, shirt pressed with military precision, brass gleaming under the cafe lights. But it wasn't Brody's uniform that Curtis noticed first. It was his ice-cold blue, narrowed with the permanent suspicion of a man who believed the world was divided into 2 simple categories: those who enforced rules and those who broke them. The chief's face bore the ruddy complexion of someone whose blood pressure ran perpetually high, veins visible at his temples even when he wasn't angry. And right now, he was angry. Brody paused inside the entrance, hands finding their way to his hips, eyes scanning the tables with practiced authority. Then his gaze landed on Curtis. The chief's lips curled slightly, part confusion, part annoyance. Without asking for a table, he started walking. Curtis didn't move, he didn't flinch. He simply picked up his water glass and took another sip. Whatever this was, it wasn't his first encounter with a man like Brody. His years in diplomatic military postings had taught him to recognize power displays before they escalated. This, he thought calmly, was a textbook example. The boots grew louder. Tables around him went still. Elise, from behind the host stand, froze mid-sentence with another guest. Chase, who had just returned from the kitchen, halted mid-step, tray in hand, eyes widening in confusion. Curtis looked out the window one more time, as if anchoring himself in the quiet world beyond the glass. Then he turned to face Brody, setting his glass gently on the table. The moment hadn't escalated yet, but everyone in the room could feel it coming, like the pressure drop before a coastal storm. Part 2. The first confrontation. The man stopped at Curtis's table, looming like a thundercloud. His presence drew every eye in the cafe. Even the gentle jazz faded into the background, replaced by a hush of held breath and quiet curiosity. His badge was pinned squarely to his chest, just above the name tag that read Chief Everett Brody. The name meant little to Curtis, but the look in the man's eyes was familiar, territorial, and brimming with the kind of authority that confused volume for respect. In that moment, Curtis could read Brody as clearly as a tactical map. Here was a man accustomed to deference, who interpreted even neutral interactions as challenges to his status. "Excuse me," Brody said, voice low but firm. "I believe you're in my seat." Curtis looked up slowly, locking eyes with the man without a hint of hesitation. His face remained unreadable, a skill honed through decades of high-stakes negotiations with foreign officials and hostile forces. He glanced around the cafe with deliberate casualness. "I wasn't aware this table was reserved," Curtis replied, his tone neither confrontational nor submissive, simply factual. "It's not," Brody snapped, placing both palms flat on the table and leaning in. "But it's mine." What Brody didn't realize, couldn't have known, was that Curtis had faced far more intimidating figures than an angry police chief. He'd negotiated with warlords in Afghanistan, stared down corrupt officials in Iraq, and once mediated a tense standoff between NATO allies that had nearly ended in gunfire. A table dispute in a Charleston cafe barely registered on his threat assessment. Curtis raised an eyebrow. "If it's not reserved, then I see no reason to move. The hostess offered me this seat. I simply accepted." Brody's jaw tensed. He straightened, unconsciously puffing his chest slightly. Every patron in the federal house was watching now, coffee cups suspended midair, conversations abandoned. "Everyone here knows that's my table," Brody said, color rising in his cheeks. "I sit here every Thursday afternoon." Curtis gave the faintest smile. "I'm not from around here, Chief. A small lead grown up 30 miles outside Charleston and returned after his military service, but one that made his point. I wouldn't know your habits." A few quiet chuckles rippled across the room, nervous ones. Brody heard them, and it didn't sit well. His pride, already wrapped too tightly around his identity, constricted further. "You don't seem to understand," he said, lowering his voice to a sharper edge. "This is my city. I make the rules here, and I'm telling you, you're in the wrong seat." Curtis remained seated, steady as stone. The cafe's tension thickened with each passing second. Martha Tillman, a 72-year-old retired librarian sitting 3 tables away, would later tell the Charleston Post and Courier that watching Curtis in that moment was like seeing a masterclass in dignity. "With all due respect, Chief," Curtis replied, "I don't answer to rules that aren't written down. If this table isn't reserved, then I have just as much right to sit here as anyone else." Brody's face darkened. A vein pulsed near his temple warning sign that Curtis noted but didn't react to. Inside, Brody was seething, his thoughts a jumble of indignation and disbelief. How dare this man challenge him? Didn't he know who he was dealing with? "I don't need to write it down," Brody hissed. "People know better." Curtis reached for his napkin and calmly refolded it across his lap, as if the conversation wasn't happening. The gesture wasn't meant to provoke, but to a man like Brody, such calm in the face of his authority felt like a slap. "Well, maybe today's a good day for people to start asking questions," Curtis said evenly. Now Brody was fuming, his fists clenching at his sides. He scanned the room quickly, no doubt looking for someone to back him up, but most folks were avoiding his gaze, clearly uncomfortable with his behavior yet too intimidated to intervene. Curtis, on the other hand, hadn't moved an inch. His posture remained relaxed, yet alert, the bearing of a man who had assessed threats in far more volatile environments than this. "You trying to embarrass me?" Brody asked, voice rising. "You think making a scene in front of my people makes you clever?" "I'm not making a scene," Curtis replied. "You walked over here, not me. I was sitting quietly, minding my own business. That's not how I see it." Curtis leaned back slightly, arms resting gently on the table. "I imagine you see a lot of things that aren't there." The air around them grew heavier, the tension sharp enough to cut. Diners at nearby tables began to shift in their seats, some reaching discreetly for their phones. Jasmine Williams, a 29-year-old social media manager seated near the counter, was the first to start recording, her screen dimmed but camera pointed squarely at the confrontation. Brody stepped closer, his right hand unconsciously drifting toward his belt. "You don't belong here," he muttered. "This isn't your kind of place." Curtis's eyes narrowed slightly. In his military career, he'd heard similar words in various forms across the globe, sometimes veiled, sometimes explicit. The implication never changed. "And what kind of place is that, Chief?" Brody didn't answer immediately. He stared down at Curtis, trying to intimidate him, but it wasn't working. Curtis's stillness only made Brody look more unstable by contrast. "You know what I mean," Brody finally sneered. "People like you always pushing limits, testing how far you can go." Curtis's voice lost its warmth. "You're referring to people like me. You might want to clarify what exactly that means before the rest of the room draws its own conclusions." Whispers began again. Diners were no longer pretending not to notice. Jasmine wasn't the only one recording now. At least 3 other patrons had their phones out, capturing the escalating tension. Brody saw them. He didn't like it. Curtis stood then, not aggressively, but deliberately. He was taller than Brody, but didn't try to tower over him. He simply stood his ground, meeting Brody's scowl with a calm that seemed to unnerve the chief more than shouting ever could. "You didn't ask," Curtis said clearly. "You ordered." "There's a difference." "I don't need permission to give orders," Brody shot back. "Especially not to someone like..." "Finish that sentence," Curtis said, his voice not raised but carrying an unmistakable command. Brody didn't. His lips curled into something between a sneer and a grimace, but even in his anger, some self-preservation instinct warned him against crossing that particular line. Curtis continued, "You wear that badge like it gives you license to bully whoever you want, but you're out of your depth, Chief. I've stared down men in real war zones. You're just loud." A quiet gasp spread across the room. Brody's face flushed red, not from embarrassment, but fury. He looked around again, saw people recording, watching, judging. That only made him angrier. "You think this is funny?" Brody growled. "You think this little stunt is going to end well for you?" "I'm not playing a game," Curtis replied. "But if I were, I'd say you're losing." Part 3. The escalation. Brody's hand twitched, fingers flexing dangerously close to his belt. Curtis noticed it. So did a few others. Someone at a nearby table stood abruptly and said, "Hey, Chief, take it easy. No need for this." "Stay out of it," Brody barked, not even turning around. Curtis didn't take his eyes off the man. "You're spiraling, Chief. Might want to step back before you make a choice you can't take back." Brody's breath was heavy now, his pride choking him worse than anything Curtis had said. He didn't like being challenged, and he certainly wasn't used to being resisted. Curtis, still standing tall, calmly reached for his glass again and took another sip, never breaking eye contact. The room was silent, no one moved. It was as if the entire cafe had fallen into a suspended moment, waiting to see which way the confrontation would turn. And Brody, face twisted and trembling, was just getting warmed up. The silence in the cafe thickened like a fog. Every breath, every slight movement seemed amplified. Coffee cups hovered midair, forks paused inches from lips. No one dared speak. Chief Brody's jaw clenched tight, his breath coming harder now. You could hear the shallow rhythm of it, like a man trying to stop himself from crossing a line but barely managing. Curtis stood unmoving, eyes steady, posture straight as a flagpole. The difference between the two men was palpable. One was anchored, the other was teetering. Elise, the young hostess, tried to break the tension. "Chief Brody, sir, maybe if we just find you another seat." "Stay out of this, Elise," Brody snapped, eyes not leaving Curtis. His voice cracked slightly under the strain of rage. "This man thinks he can just walk in here and disrespect me. In my city, in front of my people. I've said nothing disrespectful," Curtis replied, tone even. "I've simply refused to be intimidated." "If that bothers you, perhaps it says more about you than it does about me." Brody let out a humorless laugh, sharp and dry. "You've got a lot of nerve." Curtis's gaze didn't waver. "I've got more than that. I've got discipline. Something you clearly left at home today. That struck a nerve." Without warning, Brody's hand shot out and grabbed the lapel of Curtis's coat, jerking it forward. The collective gasp from the room hit like a wave. Glasses rattled on tabletops. Elise let out a quiet yelp. Chase dropped a plate he'd been holding, the ceramics shattering near his feet. But Curtis didn't stagger. He didn't punch back. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply reached up, peeled Brody's hand off his coat with the quiet strength of a man who had disarmed more dangerous threats in darker places and said, "Let go." Now, for the first time, Brody hesitated. The weight of eyes on him started to register people were filming. A couple across the room had their phones out. An older man at the bar leaned in, mouth open in disbelief. The entire cafe had become a stage, and Brody, the reckless lead actor. "But ego is a cruel master. I don't give a damn who you think you are," Brody snarled. "You don't get to show up and talk down to me in my town." Curtis adjusted his coat calmly. "I haven't talked down to you, Chief. But you're doing a fine job proving why some men shouldn't wear a badge. That did it." With a curse under his breath, Brody shoved the table aside with his hip. It screeched across the floor, knocking over a glass of sweet tea and a salt shaker that rolled to a stop beneath another table. Diners jumped back. Chairs scraped loudly. The calm atmosphere shattered like the plate at Chase's feet. Brody's hand drifted again toward his belt, and this time, his fingers found their target. Curtis's voice, sharp now, cut through the air. "Don't." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't panicked, but it was powerful. A command. Brody froze for a half-second, caught between instinct and impulse. You could see the war behind his eyes. His fingers twitched near the holster, itching, wanting. "I'm warning you," Brody growled. "Step back." Curtis didn't move. "You draw that weapon," he said slowly, "and the moment changes. You stop being a man having a tantrum in a cafe and become a criminal with a gun. Are you sure you want that?" From the corner booth, someone whispered, "Is he really going to draw on him?" Another voice, older and trembling, replied, "My God, he might." A woman near the entrance quietly opened the cafe door, letting it swing slowly as if preparing an escape route. The room was holding its collective breath. Brody's hand hovered. Curtis still stood tall, unshaken, as if daring the man to cross that invisible line. Then came the voice. "You need to stop right there, Chief." Everyone turned. A man in his 30s had stood up near the back of the room, athletic build, clean-cut, with a service tattoo just visible beneath the sleeve of his t-shirt. Later, Everyone would learn this was Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, 82nd Airborne, currently on leave visiting family in Charleston. Torres stepped forward, palms open, firm but respectful. "I served under that man," he said, nodding to Curtis. "He's Major General Curtis Langston, United States Army. You're threatening the wrong guy." Brody blinked. Curtis didn't smile, didn't react. He simply kept his eyes on Brody, watching the man unravel one frayed thread at a time. "He's bluffing," Brody snapped, though his voice cracked at the edges. "No, sir, he's not," Torres replied, "and you're being filmed from at least 4 different angles." "You want to spend the rest of your career explaining why you pulled a weapon on a retired general over a cafe table? Another phone rose into the air, then another." The crowd had turned, not physically, but spiritually. No longer spectators, they had quietly chosen a side, and Brody could feel it. Curtis stepped forward, not threateningly, just closing the gap between them with the certainty of someone who had spent decades walking into danger without flinching. "You don't know me," Curtis said, voice low but commanding. "But I know men like you. You confuse volume for strength, fear for respect. You've worn that badge so long you think it gives you the right to push people down. But today you picked the wrong man." Brody's lips trembled. His hand dropped from his belt, hesitated, then retreated. Curtis nodded once, not in triumph, but in acknowledgement of the restraint that had just spared them both something far worse. Without another word, Curtis reached down, pulled the table gently back into place, and picked up the spilled salt shaker. The room began to breathe again. No one applauded, no one cheered, but the message was loud and clear. The moment hadn't ended, but the balance of power had shifted. Brody stood frozen, his chest heaving, eyes darting around the cafe like a trapped animal. The stillness was unnatural, like the moment just before a thunderclap. He could feel the judgment in the air, thick and stinging, tightening around him like a noose. Phones pointed in his direction like spotlights on a stage he never intended to stand on, and he didn't know how to get off it. Curtis remained exactly where he was, tall, calm, watchful. It was the kind of silence that didn't soothe it accused, and it was about to break. Part 4, The Point of No Return. "Enough of this," Brody spat, stepping back a half pace. He waved an arm like he could shoo the judgment away. "All of you, put your damn phones away. No one moved." One man in the back, James Cooper, 62, a retired high school principal, said quietly but firmly, "You're out of line, Chief." That was all it took. The tension snapped. Brody's right hand shot toward his belt in one fluid motion, not stopping at his radio or handcuffs, but his gun, and in a heartbeat he drew it. The cafe erupted into chaos. Screams tore through the air. A woman ducked under her table. Chase dropped a tray full of dishes with a crash. Glass shattered everywhere. Elise grabbed an elderly couple by the arm and pulled them behind the counter. Someone knocked over a chair in a mad scramble toward the exit, but the door jammed as several patrons tried to escape at once. Curtis didn't move. The barrel of the gun was inches from his chest, pointed straight at his heart, his eyes locked on Brody's. Not defiant, not afraid, just focused, steady. "Put it down," Curtis said softly. Brody's hand trembled, but he didn't lower it. His lips were twitching, breath erratic. He looked less like a man in control, and more like someone who had lost the map completely. The pressure had gotten to him, and now the entire world was watching him crumble. "I said, put it down," Curtis repeated, more forcefully now. "You're about to ruin your life." Brody's finger flinched near the trigger. A few feet away, a young man in jeans and a worn Air Force sweatshirt was crouched behind a chair. His phone was streaming live on Instagram. Over 70, 0 viewers were watching the event unfold in real time. Comments poured in like a river. "Is this real? He's aiming a weapon at a vet. This is Charleston, right? Someone call the state police." The camera shook slightly as the young man tried to breathe evenly. Curtis didn't look at it. He didn't look at the people around him. His entire focus was on Brody. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, voice calm but sharp like a blade unsheathed. "You're pointing a firearm at a retired officer of the United States Army. My name is Curtis Langston, Major General. 2 combat tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. I've served this country longer than you've worn that badge, and right now you're making the gravest mistake of your career." Brody blinked, jaw clenching, nostrils flaring. "You think your title scares me?" he hissed. "It's not the title that should scare you," Curtis said. "It's what happens next." Because the moment you pulled that weapon, this stopped being a power trip and became a federal crime." Someone in the crowd yelled, "You're on live right now." Everyone's seeing this. Another voice shouted, "Put the gun down!" Brody flinched at the chorus. His eyes twitched left and right, scanning for an escape, but he was surrounded by faces, phones, judgment. The walls had closed in. Curtis took a step forward. "Easy," he said. "You don't want to do this. You really don't want to do this." The gun wavered. Brody's hand was shaking now, really shaking. Sweat beaded along his temple. His breathing came in short bursts. Curtis's voice dropped, almost like he was speaking to a frightened child. "Think about your pension, your family. Think about the people watching. You point that weapon at me for one more second and there's no undoing it. There's no excuse, no walking it back. You'll be the face of disgrace for every badge in this state." For the first time, Curtis could see recognition in Brody's eyes. Fear not of Curtis, not even of the gun, but of what he'd become, of what he was about to lose. Then, like an alarm waking someone from a nightmare, a voice crackled through Brody's radio. "All units, we have multiple 911 reports from the Federal House Cafe. Chief Brody, stand down immediately. Repeat, stand down. You are being recorded. Step back now." The entire cafe heard it. Brody blinked. His arm dropped slightly. His fingers loosened on the grip. Curtis didn't breathe. Then the chief's hand slowly, reluctantly released the gun and let it drop just enough to no longer aim at anyone. His shoulders sagged. His face twisted with shame, confusion, and wounded pride. Curtis gently stepped forward, still watching the man's every twitch. With 2 fingers, he reached up and carefully pressed the barrel of the weapon downward until it faced the floor. A long exhale rippled through the room like everyone had just remembered how to breathe. Curtis stepped back and spoke in a calm but carrying voice. Someone called the mayor and the state attorney. The young man with the Air Force hoodie was still filming, still broadcasting, and you could hear the collective response of tens of thousands of viewers reacting in real time. Brody stood there, still holding the gun like he wasn't quite sure how it had ended up in his hand to begin with. Then another voice came from the doorway. "Chief Brody," it said, clipped and official. "Hand over your weapon." Everyone turned. Lieutenant James Rodriguez of the State Highway Patrol had just stepped inside, followed by 2 plainclothes agents with credentials hanging from their necks. Brody looked at them confused, as if seeing them through fog. "You're done," Rodriguez said flatly. "Give me the weapon." And like a man whose body had finally given out, Brody slowly handed it over. Rodriguez took it, stepped back, and said to Curtis, "Sir, are you all right?" Curtis gave a small nod. "I'm fine, but I think your city's about to have one hell of a press conference." Rodriguez cracked a faint, surprised smile. "Yes, sir. I imagine we will." Part 5. The Aftermath. The cafe was still a mess. Tables overturned, glasses broken, food untouched, but the energy was beginning to shift. People were speaking again, quietly at first. A few clapped nervously, then with more confidence. Curtis sat back down, calm as ever. Someone walked up and set a fresh glass of sweet tea in front of him. "No charge," the owner, Benjamin Wilson, said quietly. Curtis Langston sat back in his chair, hands folded calmly in his lap. Around him, the cafe slowly returned to something resembling normal, though the energy had shifted for good. Broken glass still lined the floor. A waitress sobbed quietly in the corner. Chairs remained overturned, but the true damage was harder to sweep up. The weapon had been handed over. The police chief had been escorted out, and yet what lingered most in the air wasn't fear, it was awe. Not just at what had happened, but at how Curtis had handled it. The calm, the restraint, the quiet dignity of a man who had stood at the edge of danger and refused to flinch. A woman in her 70s, Margaret Wells, a retired schoolteacher who'd taught at Charleston High for 42 years, approached his table cautiously, holding a paper napkin in one hand and her phone in the other. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude," she said gently. "But thank you. I've never seen anything like that in my life." Curtis offered her a small nod, the kind of gesture that said, "I appreciate that," without needing the words. He wasn't doing this for thanks. He never had. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, more units arriving too late to stop what had already unfolded. Elise, still pale from the shock, stepped carefully toward Curtis, placing a warm biscuit on a clean plate in front of him, as if anchoring the moment back into something human. He gave her a tired smile. "Would you like us to call someone for you?" she asked, voice still shaky. Curtis shook his head. "No need. Everything that needed to be said has already been said." And it had. The footage was already spreading on phones, tablets, and screens across the country. By 6:00 p.m. that evening, the first segment aired on local news. Breaking: Charleston Police Chief pulls gun on retired Army general. By 8:00 p.m., it had hit national broadcasts. CNN ran a special report. Fox News interviewed former military officials. MSNBC brought in legal analysts. The still frame Brody with his weapon raised. Curtis standing unmoved became the image of the week. It was on newspapers, thumbnails, and cable TV tickers. The hashtags took on a life of their own. Curtis Langston, the General, stand tall. The internet did what it always did, turned a moment into a movement. But while others were organizing, debating, dissecting, Curtis was back in his kitchen folding laundry. He hadn't checked the news. He didn't need to. A man knew when the world was on fire, even if he wasn't holding the match. Part 6: The Reckoning. By May 19th, just 48 hours after the incident, Charleston was in turmoil. Mayor Sophia Harrison called an emergency press conference on the steps of City Hall. The events at the Federal House Cafe were deeply disturbing, she stated, cameras flashing in her face. Chief Brody has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Let me be clear, there is no place in this city for abuse of power. It wasn't enough for some people. By noon, protesters began to gather outside City Hall. Signs reading, "Honor the General, he protected us. Who protects him?" filled the sidewalks. Curtis's name was trending on social media platforms he didn't even use. But Curtis remained quiet. He didn't show up at rallies. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't turn the moment into a platform. He just lived. In the midst of the storm, that silence spoke volumes. Meanwhile, more stories began to surface. Officers who had worked under Brody in the past. People in the community who'd experienced his intimidation firsthand. Citizens who'd never felt safe speaking up suddenly found the courage. "He's been like this for years," Officer Marcus Jenkins admitted anonymously to a local reporter. But no one wanted to challenge him until now. The tide was turning, and Curtis, without ever raising his voice, had become the reason. That weekend, May 20 Honest, the Mount Zion AIM Church held a community forum. Veterans, retired law enforcement, clergy, and community members came together to talk not just about what happened, but what came next. People didn't just want accountability, they wanted change. Curtis was invited to speak. He showed up quietly wearing a navy blue blazer and a pin of the American flag on his lapel. When he stepped up to the podium, the room stood in applause. Not a thunderous roar, but something more heartfelt, respectful, lasting. He held up a hand and waited for silence. "I didn't ask to be part of any movement," he began. "And I didn't come here to talk about myself. What happened was wrong, but what matters more is what we do now." He paused, scanning the faces before him, young, old, black, white, uniform, and civilian. "I spent my life in service. I led men and women into combat zones. I wrote letters to mothers whose sons didn't come home. I held my tongue when I was angry, and I stood tall when I was scared. And I'll tell you the same thing I told my troops." Another pause. The room leaned in. Courage isn't about what you feel. It's about what you do, especially when you're afraid. He looked around the church hall, all those faces watching him with wide, steady eyes. "Let's not waste this moment." He stepped down to another standing ovation. Still no smile, just a quiet nod. And then he returned to his seat in the third row, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Curtis Langston had become more than a man. He'd become a symbol, an America, especially the America that remembered a time when dignity came before noise was paying attention. By Monday morning, May 2021, the footage of Chief Brody pointing his gun at Curtis Langston had been shown on every major news network. CNN looped it during a morning panel on law enforcement accountability. Fox News called it a troubling example of unchecked emotion in leadership. MSNBC ran a special segment titled "Courage and Calm, the Man Who Didn't Flinch." The still frame Brody with his weapon raised, Curtis, standing unmoved, appeared on the front page of the New York Times. The Washington Post ran an editorial titled "The Quiet Strength That Shames Us All." Meanwhile, the city's Civilian Review Board released a preliminary report on May 24th. It was scathing. Chief Brody's conduct demonstrated a serious lapse in judgment and a failure to adhere to basic protocols regarding escalation, engagement, and professional conduct. His actions endangered the lives of civilians and disrespected the dignity of a retired service member. The report ended with a single recommendation: termination. That same day, the Charleston Police Department's official website quietly updated its leadership page. Brody's photo was gone. Word spread quickly. Curtis received the news while sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea in hand. His neighbor, Mr. Priam, is an 84-year-old widower who still cut his own grass, shuffled over and said, "You did it, Kurt." They fired him. Curtis didn't grin. He didn't raise a toast, he just nodded. That's the least they could do. What he didn't say, but thought, was this: accountability wasn't the same as justice. And justice still had a long road ahead. Later that evening, a news crew showed up on his lawn. "Mr. Langston," the reporter called from the sidewalk, "do you have any comment now that Chief Brody has been removed from duty?" Curtis didn't answer at first. He walked down the porch steps, the soft creak of old wood echoing beneath his boots. He stood on the grass, arms folded. "I have no joy in seeing a man lose his job," he said. But he made a choice, one he'll have to live with. "I've spent my life telling young soldiers that your rank doesn't define your character. Your actions do." And his actions spoke loud and clear. "Do you plan to take legal action?" the reporter pressed. Curtis shook his head. "That's not my focus. I'm not here to punish. I'm here to push for this country to do better. If this moment can be used for good, for real reform, then maybe something decent can come out of it." The reporter tried for one more question, but Curtis turned and walked back inside. He wasn't interested in being the headline. He was interested in what came after it. Part 7, The Transformation. The Sunday after Brody was fired, May 28th, the air in Charleston was thick with summer heat and something more powerfunity. The city hadn't seen a week like this in decades. Not since the old shipyard strikes in the 70s, not since Hurricane Hugo in '89, which had forced everyone, rich and poor, black and white, to survive together. There was a quiet electric energy running through the streets. People were no longer whispering about what happened. They were talking boldly, publicly, and not just about Brody, but about what Curtis Langston stood for. It wasn't long before the veterans in town decided to do something more than just talk. The local VFW chapter, Post 143, hosted a gathering on June 20. It wasn't a protest. There were no chants or angry signs, just folding chairs under a canopy, a few American flags, and a row of aging soldiers with silver hair and firm handshakes coming together for something deeper than outrage. They called it a salute to service. Curtis hadn't planned to attend. He didn't want to be the centerpiece of anything. He didn't need applause or cameras or validation. But when Colonel Anita Gaines called him personally, he couldn't say no. She had once commanded a medevac unit in Iraq, saving lives under mortar fire. She'd earned 2 Bronze Stars. And now, in her 70s, she ran a mentorship program for young veterans trying to adjust to civilian life. "I know you don't want the attention," she'd said over the phone, "but this isn't about attention. It's about letting people see what real service looks like." So that Sunday, Curtis showed up. He wore a simple blazer, the same pair of slacks he'd worn to church the week before, and his old military service pin on his chest, tarnished from years of disuse, but still shining in the sun. As he walked onto the lawn behind the VFW hall, dozens of heads turned. Some people clapped, others just stood, but every single veteran in uniform saluted. Curtis paused. It had been a long time since he'd been rendered a salute, especially on American soil. Slowly, he raised his hand and returned the gesture. Colonel Gaines stepped forward to greet him, her stride stiff from an old hip injury, but her eyes sharp and steady. "I'm glad you came," she said. Curtis nodded. "Wasn't sure I should." "You didn't come for yourself," she said. "You came for all of us." The event wasn't long, but it was powerful. One by one, veterans stood to speak not just about the cafe incident, but about the broader story it represented. A Marine who'd served in Vietnam said, "We fought for a country that didn't always fight for us." But when we see a man like General Langston stand his ground with grace, it reminds us of the kind of America we still believe in. A Gulf War medic added, "That man didn't just face a gun. He faced a system that too often disrespects those who've served, especially if their skin is brown. And he never lost his temper. That's discipline, that's leadership." Curtis sat through it all, his expression composed but soft. He didn't smile much. He didn't cry. But his hands, resting in his lap, trembled slightly, not from fear or pride, but from the quiet weight of being seen, truly seen by his peers. When Colonel Gaines invited him to the podium, he hesitated before rising, not because he was unsure of what to say, but because part of him didn't want to say anything at all. He'd already said enough in that cafe with his presence, his silence, his restraint, but the people were waiting, and he was never one to turn his back on duty. He stepped up, cleared his throat, and looked out at the sea of faces. "Thank you," he began, "for showing up, for speaking out, for reminding me that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what I was trained to do. I stayed calm. I stayed grounded, and I let a man walk himself into the consequences of his own choices." Another pause. "Now, I've been saluted, decorated, thanked, and I appreciate all of it. But if we're going to talk about honor, let's talk about what it really means." He scanned the crowd, eyes firm. Honor means you don't use power to intimidate the powerless. It means you speak up when it's easier to stay quiet. And it means that when people see injustice, whether it's on a battlefield or in a neighborhood cafe, they have the courage to do more than film it. They act. A hush fell over the crowd. Curtis finished simply, "We owe it to the next generation to be better examples. Let this moment be a reminder not of violence or fear, but of discipline, of integrity, and of peace under pressure." He stepped down to a standing ovation. Curtis didn't wave. He just returned to his seat, folded his hands once again, and listened as the crowd sang "America the Beautiful" under the Carolina sun. It wasn't about him anymore. It was about all of them and something far bigger than any one man. Part 8. The Shadow Moves. For a few days, things seemed to settle in Charleston. The headlines moved on to the next political scandal. Social media's attention wavered. Yet, beneath the surface, the aftershocks of the cafe incident continued to ripple, especially for Chief Everett Brody. He had been fired, yes, removed from duty, publicly disgraced. But men like Brody didn't fade quietly. Not when their ego was bruised, not when the world had seen them fall. He wasn't just humiliated, he was obsessed. In the privacy of his suburban home on James Island, blinds drawn tight, Brody stewed. Every time he turned on the TV, there was Curtis Langston's facile stoic, calm, unwilling to be rattled. That image played over and over in his mind, driving him deeper into his bitterness. He blamed the public, the mayor, the press. But most of all, he blamed Curtis. In his mind, Curtis hadn't just disrespected him in a cafe. He had destroyed his career, his legacy, his family name, and Brody wanted payback. He still had friends officers who owed him favors, some who were loyal, others simply afraid. Through them, Brody got access to information he shouldn't have had. He wanted to know who had filmed him, who had shared the footage, who was helping Curtis behind the scenes. And he especially wanted to know what skeletons Curtis might have hidden away. "Everyone's got something," Brody told Daniel Perkins, a private investigator he hired off the books on June 7th. "Find it," the man nodded. "Anything specific you're looking for?" Brody sneered. "Military records, lawsuits, ex-wives, bad debts, disciplinary reviews. I don't care. I want something I can use." The investigator set to work. Within days, he was poking through databases, questioning old colleagues, even staking out Curtis's house from across the street in a beat-up sedan. He took photos, tracked Curtis's movements, sent notes back to Brody. But there was nothing scandalous to find. Curtis Langston lived quietly, honorably. He paid his bills, helped his neighbors, visited veterans in hospice care. No arrests, no scandals, no drama. Still, the scrutiny didn't go unnoticed. Curtis had seen the car outside. He'd seen the same man walking past his mailbox more than once, and he knew exactly what it meant. But he didn't react. Instead, he did what he'd always done. He observed, waited, and thought. It was a skill honed in war zones where the first to panic usually died. It was no different now. Meanwhile, support for Curtis grew in ways that Brody hadn't expected. Young veterans inspired by his story started organizing events across the state. A podcast featuring Curtis's old speeches from military academy days went viral. A GoFundMe set up by a stranger raised tens of thousands of dollars to support a veterans justice fund in his name. Brody watched it all with rage boiling in his gut. He had gone from the city's most powerful man to a punchline in under a week. Still, he pressed on. He had one last card to play. Late one evening, June 14th, the private investigator returned with what he thought might be leverage. An old letter of reprimand from 35 years ago when Curtis, still a young captain, had been disciplined for speaking out against a superior officer who'd made a racially insensitive comment during a training exercise. It wasn't much, but to Brody, it was gold. "Let's leak it," he said. The next morning, June 15th, a fringe political blog ran a story titled "The Hidden History of General Curtis Langston," claiming he had a pattern of insubordination and racial bias complaints in his record. Most people ignored it. Some read it, shrugged, and moved on. But Brody had hoped it would create doubt, maybe just enough to dent Curtis's image. Curtis saw the article the same way he saw the man parked outside his house. He didn't respond. He didn't post a rebuttal. He didn't call the paper. He simply walked his usual route through Hampton Park, greeted a neighbor, and volunteered that evening at a food pantry downtown. But others responded for him. Colonel Anita Gaines published a public letter defending him, describing the incident as a moment of moral courage in a system that didn't know what to do with it. Dozens of Curtis's former students, soldiers, and commanders shared stories on social media of his honesty and integrity. A retired three-star general tweeted, "I trust Curtis Langston with my life. I have, and I would again tomorrow." Brody had wanted to bury him in doubt. Instead, he buried himself further in disgrace. Still, Curtis couldn't ignore what was happening around him. The surveillance, the whisper campaigns, the sudden increase in strange cars passing by his house at night. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. So one morning, June 18th, Curtis walked down his front steps, approached the car parked half a block away, and knocked gently on the window. The man inside flinched, rolled it down halfway. "Tell Brody," Curtis said evenly, "if he wants to talk to me, he knows where I live. But if he keeps hiding behind cowards, I'll make sure the state police know he's still pulling strings." The man stammered, "Toom just doing a job." "Then quit," Curtis said, "and go get a better one." He turned and walked away without another word. That same afternoon, the car was gone. It didn't return. Curtis went back inside, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stared out at the magnolia tree in his front yard. The wind rustled the leaves. The light filtered through the branches. And in that moment, he felt the truth settle over him like a worn, familiar coat. This fight wasn't over, but he wasn't alone in it, and no amount of shadows could stand against a man who walked in daylight without fear. Part 9. The Hearing, June 20, 2023. The city of Charleston had seen many official hearings over the year's budget meetings, zoning disputes, political infighting, but nothing quite like this. Inside the packed municipal auditorium, every seat was filled. Lines stretched out the door, down the courthouse steps, and into the street. News vans were parked 3 deep along the curb. Protesters stood on one side of the entrance, signs held high. Supporters stood on the other, quiet but firm. Police kept a watchful eye on everyone, but for once their presence didn't feel threatening. It felt necessary. Inside, a panel of 6 members sat at the long bench under the seal of the City of Charleston. They represented the Civilian Review Board, the Department of Justice, and the Office of Police Oversight. This wasn't a trial, not in the legal sense, but it carried the weight of one. The city had promised transparency, and the people had shown up to collect. In the front row, Curtis Langston sat quietly, flanked by Colonel Anita Gaines and Reverend James Holloway. His hands were folded in his lap, his spine straight, his expression unreadable. He wore a simple gray suit with no medals, no ribbons, no display of rank, but still, he was the most commanding presence in the room. At the far end of the chamber sat Everett Brody. Gone was the polished uniform and the swagger. In its place was a man in a cheap blazer, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched tight. His attorney sat beside him, whispering occasionally, but Brody didn't respond. He stared forward like a man waiting to be sentenced by a world he no longer recognized. The hearing began with procedural statements. The chairwoman, Dr. Slash. Elaine Washington read aloud the scope of the inquiry, whether Chief Brody's actions at the Federal House Cafe constituted abuse of authority, improper use of force, and conduct unbecoming of a public official. The words sounded sterile on paper, but then they played the video in full. No edits, no commentary, just the raw, unfiltered truth. The footage started with Curtis sitting quietly, then showed Brody approaching, the escalation, the confrontation. The gasps in the room came when Brody slammed his hands on the table. Then came the shove, then the gun. It was no longer just a story, it was evidence. At one point, a woman in the gallery audibly whispered, "He didn't even blink." Another voice replied, "That's a man who knows what real danger looks like." The rest of the room sat still, many leaning forward, breathing shallowly. Even the board members, trained to remain impartial, shifted in their seats. When the video ended, the room was silent. "Doctor." Washington cleared her throat and called the first witness, Chase Bennett, the waiter from the cafe. He walked to the stand nervously, wiping his palms on his pants. His voice shook at first, but steadied as he spoke. "He was calm the whole time," Chase said, nodding toward Curtis. "He wasn't disrespectful. He didn't raise his voice. The general just refused to be bullied." "Chief Brody, he just lost control. I thought he was going to shoot him." Several more witnesses followed. Patrons, staff, a young woman who'd hidden behind the dessert case and filmed from a second angle. Each account echoed the last. Curtis had been calm. Brody had been hostile. And a tragedy had barely been averted. Then it was Curtis's turn. He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the witness table with measured steps. The room held its breath. Dr. Washington offered him water. He declined. "Mr. Langston," she began, "we appreciate your presence here. Would you please share, in your own words, what happened that day?" Curtis took a moment before answering. His voice was low, steady, but filled the chamber. "I walked into a cafe to have lunch," he said. "That's all I did. I didn't provoke anyone. I didn't demand anything. I took the seat I was offered. And for that, I had a gun pointed at my chest. No dramatics, no anger, just facts. But what happened in that cafe wasn't just about a table," he continued. "It was about power. About a man who thought his badge gave him the right to intimidate someone who didn't flinch when challenged." He paused, scanning the room. "I didn't flinch because I've been trained not to. I didn't raise my voice because I've spent a lifetime learning to de-escalate, not inflame. But make no mistake, if I hadn't been who I was, if I didn't carry the rank, the skin, the age, the presence I do, there's a chance I wouldn't be standing here today." There it was. Curtis didn't accuse. He revealed. "I'm not here because I need closure," he said. "I'm here because the people of this city deserve to know the truth about who wears their badge, about how close they came to burying a citizen instead of firing an officer." When he finished, the room remained still, not because they were unmoved, but because they were overwhelmed. Brody's attorney tried to shift the tone, claiming his client had felt threatened, that the situation was a misunderstanding fueled by confusion and emotion. But the board wasn't buying it. After closing statements, the panel recessed for deliberation. People in the gallery stood to stretch, whispering to one another. Outside, reporters were already crafting their headlines. Inside, Curtis sat back down in the front row, still composed. Colonel Gaines leaned in and whispered, "That was the finest testimony I've ever seen." Curtis didn't smile. He simply said, "Let's hope it makes a difference." 45 minutes later, the board returned. Dr. Washington read the findings aloud. Chief Everett Brody had violated departmental policy. He had displayed conduct unfit for any officer of the law. His actions endangered civilians, and most significantly, he had abused his authority in a manner that could have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. The board's recommendation was clear. Brody was to be permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity within the state. Additionally, the findings would be forwarded to the state's attorney for potential criminal charges. A gasp rippled through the room. Brody didn't move. He stared ahead, hollowed out, defeated. Curtis stood, nodded once toward the panel, and turned to leave. Reporters rushed toward him, shouting questions, but he didn't stop. He'd said everything he needed to. As he stepped outside into the warm Charleston air, people began to clap. Not the wild cheers of a crowd hungry for spectacle, but the long, measured applause of a community that had just seen justice done. Curtis didn't wave. He simply placed his hat on his head, straightened his coat, and walked down the courthouse steps like the soldier he'd always been moving forward, one quiet step at a time. Part 10. The Legacy. The days after the tribunal felt different in Charleston. The tension that had gripped the city for weeks didn't vanish, but it softened, replaced by something unfamiliar, something close to relief. For the first time in a long while, people walked into public buildings with their heads a little higher, a little lighter. Conversations in grocery store lines and barber shops started with a new kind of phrase. Did you hear what General Langston said? He told the truth. Right to their faces, that man saved more than himself. He reminded the rest of us how to act when it matters. Curtis Langston didn't seek that attention. He hadn't given another interview. He didn't appear on cable news. In fact, after the verdict was read, he'd gone straight home, taken off his suit jacket, and started tending to the garden behind his house, pulling weeds in the dirt like any other afternoon. But the world wasn't done with him. Within a week of the hearing, the Charleston Police Department announced a new set of reforms. Mandatory body cameras on all officers, quarterly de-escalation training, and the creation of a civilian oversight committee that would meet monthly with community members. These weren't Band-Aid measures. They were structural changes, long overdue and now politically unstoppable. At the next City Council meeting on July 11th, Councilwoman Diana Shaw read aloud a motion to rename a portion of Bay Street the block where the Federal House Cafe stood to Langston Way. The motion passed unanimously. When Curtis heard about it, he chuckled quietly. "I didn't ask for a street," he told Colonel Gaines when she called. "I just wanted a quiet lunch." "You didn't get that," she replied. "But what you gave the rest of us, it was something better." Meanwhile, the cafe itself had become something of a pilgrimage site, not because of the confrontation, but because of what followed it. Veterans from out of town visited just to sit near the window where Curtis once stood. Teachers brought their students there to talk about courage, restraint, and character. The owners had installed a small brass plaque near the window, polished and discreet. It read, "In honor of Major General Curtis Langston, who reminded us all that dignity is the highest form of strength." Curtis didn't make a big deal about it, but he did stop by once, early in the morning before the cafe opened. Elise let him in. No cameras, no crowd, just a quiet nod, a fresh cup of coffee, and a moment to breathe in the calm before another day began. Still, something inside him stirred. Curtis had never been a man to chase platforms, but he had always been a teacher at heart. And as the days turned into weeks and the calls and letters kept coming from young veterans, community leaders, even teenagers, he started to realize that this moment wasn't something to walk away from. It was something to build from. So, on August Honest, 2023, he started the Langston Fellowship for Civil and Civic Integrity, a program aimed at mentoring young men and women transitioning out of the military or struggling with authority. It offered training in conflict resolution, public service, emotional regulation, and community leadership. Curtis held weekly seminars in church basements and community centers where he spoke plainly, often beginning each session with the same words, "I'm not here to make you feel powerful. I'm here to remind you how to carry power responsibly." The program spread quickly not because of viral marketing or flashy branding, but because it came from the right person at the right time. Veterans respected him. Civilians trusted him. Politicians, even the reluctant ones, knew better than to question his motives. And Curtis never made it about him. He refused to let anyone call him a hero. When Charleston Magazine tried to run a feature titled "The Man Who Changed Charleston," he declined the interview and sent back a handwritten note, "The people changed Charleston. I just didn't get in their way." But those closest to him knew the truth. Curtis had changed something much bigger than a city. He'd reminded a nation, especially those who'd lived through the long, slow battles of civil rights, war, division, and doubt, that a man could still stand tall without raising his fists. That sometimes the strongest act wasn't confrontation, it was control. On the one-year anniversary of the cafe incident, May 17, 2024, the Federal House hosted a private dinner. No press, just the people who were there that day. Chase, Elise, the elderly couple who'd huddled behind the booth, even the young Air Force veteran who'd live-streamed the confrontation. They gathered around Curtis, passing dishes and stories, laughter mixing with reflection. At the end of the night, Elise stood and raised a glass of sweet tea. "To the man who reminded us what grace under pressure looks like," she said. "You didn't just keep your cool, sir. You gave us back a little bit of faith." Curtis smiled for the first time in a long while, not because he agreed with the sentiment, but because in that moment he saw that people had absorbed the lesson. Later, as he walked back to his car under the warm glow of the street lamps, someone called out his name. It was a young man, maybe 20, holding the door for his grandmother. "General Langston," he said nervously, "can I shake your hand?" Curtis extended his palm. The handshake was firm, sincere. "Thank you, sir," the boy said, "for what you did." Curtis looked him in the eye. "It's not what I did," he replied. "It's what you do next that matters." The boy nodded, understanding more than Curtis expected. Back home, Curtis hung his blazer on the back of the chair, loosened his collar, and sat down to write in the leather-bound notebook he kept by the window. He wasn't writing a memoir. He didn't believe in writing books about yourself. Instead, he wrote reflections, short lessons, things he hoped his grandchildren might read one day. That night, he wrote, "Character isn't revealed when people are watching. It's revealed when you think no one is. But if you live right, people will see it anyway, and they'll carry it with them long after you've left the room." He closed the notebook, turned out the lamp, and sat quietly, listening to the wind stir through the magnolia branches outside. It had all started with a table, and now a city stood taller because one man refused to sit down. Epilogue. The story of Curtis Langston carries a powerful and timeless message. Dignity, composure, and integrity never go out of style. And sometimes they are the strongest weapons we have against injustice. In a world that often rewards noise and anger, Curtis didn't yell, he didn't fight back with rage. He simply stood his ground, looked injustice in the eye, and refused to back down. And that quiet strength moved an entire city. For older adults who've lived through decades of change, this story is more than inspiration. It's a reminder, you're never too old to make a difference. And your character may be the greatest legacy you leave behind. Choosing calm over conflict and courage over ego plants seeds of change for the next generation. Sometimes all it takes is one person standing tall with grace to show others how to rise. When silence becomes complicity, there's only one choice: speak up. Which side will you stand on?